Christ comes shining through, and I am blessed to be with you, O holy child of God. Please be seated. I love this little song. I love the hope that I can see the love of God in others or our neighbor. I mean, really see it. And more than that, that you will see the love of God in me. Isn't that our hope? Seeing God in others and in ourselves, being seen as a place where God resides. Been thinking this week, if you had a superpower, what would it be? You know, super strength, the ability to stretch. As a 5'2" person, stretching sounds fun. Shooting spider webs, being invisible. In the gospel, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man calls us to practice what some have called the superpower of sacred sight. Sacred sight allows us to see the world as it is, lets us look both at joy and suffering. Super sight is what we need to look around the room, any room, and see what people need. A smile, a hug, a wave, a sandwich. In the gospel, the rich man couldn't or wouldn't or didn't see what was right outside his home. Wow, we say. How could he have missed that? I see the love of God in you. You may think that's great, sacred sight, but you may be thinking, I don't have any superpowers. You do. We all have been given sacred power by God, holy power. God gives us hope and faith and love. And with these sacred powers, hope, faith, and love, we do God's work in the world. Sight, seeing with our eyes, we do that. We look around and we see and we register the things that we have seen. But sometimes that doesn't happen, does it? We don't see things right in front of us, or we're pretty developed at ignoring, seeing things that we don't want to see. Sacred sight is when we see with our hearts. When we look at people with our hearts, then we can really see them. It's very hard to ignore people when we've seen them with our hearts. Looking with our hearts, we can see a person's needs and wants, their joys and sadnesses. We can see that we are all alike. We can see each other as children of God. And when we see each other as children of God, we are more able to share those sacred superpowers of hope and faith and love. Through the power of sacred sight, we strengthen God's community and make the world a much more beautiful place. Jesus has been spending time with the Pharisees. Our gospel kind of starts in the middle of a conversation that he's been having. The Pharisees are trying really, really hard to wrap their heads around the teachings he brings. They are struggling to hear his words about justice and mercy, compassion, because they have been charged to be keepers of the tradition, bearers of the faith, experts in religious studies. And more than that, they are negotiators between the people of Israel and the Roman authorities. I think that's a job no one wants. It'd be like an agent trying to find a job for Antonio Brown. Or, I know, maybe too soon. Okay, or settle a contract with the auto workers. Or walking a line in Congress between rumor and fact. The Pharisees are having a very difficult time seeing what is this good news that Jesus is bringing. And he tries to help us, to see what we are missing. He's trying to show them where their vision is clouded. Showing us what where Richard Rohr says culture can often cloud our vision, where materialism or righteousness takes the place of seeing what is really there. So, Jesus tells the story to the Pharisees. There are two men, a rich man who lived an extravagant life, well-dressed, feasting every day safely behind his gates. And nearby, just outside those gates, was Lazarus. Now, Lazarus is the very opposite of the rich man. He's poor, alone, hungry, suffering, diseased, barely living, befriended only by dogs who came to lick his wounds. Now, as it happens in life, both men die. The rich man goes to Hades, where he is tormented, and Lazarus, carried by angels, now rests in the arms of Abraham, loved, protected, and safe. Only after they die does the rich man finally see Lazarus. He sees him and somehow knows his name. Oh, how his fortune has changed. Now it's the rich man who thirsts. Now he is alone and tormented. And Abraham, sitting with Lazarus, denies the rich man's pleas for water and refuses to send a warning to those in his family. What are we to make of this story? This parable? Is it a prediction? Is it a warning? Certainly from the prophet Amos in that first reading, we hear a very similar message, a message of woe to those who are complacent, to those who have thought too little about the suffering in the world and the consequence of what happens when we choose isolation over seeing. Is it possible it could be a warning and an invitation? How often do I surround myself with comfort in an effort to numb my own suffering and the suffering I see around me? And yet, as a result, I am further isolated from everyone and unable to see Lazarus outside my gates. From the text, besides all this, between you and us, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us. Between us is this chasm. This chasm has captured my attention as I considered the frightening reality of the depth of the chasms that exist in our world. The distance between us and them. The distance between the wealthy and the poor. The distance between the immigrant and native. The distance between God and me. This is what I hear Amos saying, what Abraham is trying to say to the rich man. If you live this way, there are consequences. When I remain behind my gate and remain unaware of the rest of the world, I will live an isolated life. I will be apart from my brothers and my sisters. My life will be separated by a great chasm. And as I wondered this week about what I avoid outside my gates, about of what I am afraid, guess I'm afraid I will lose what I have. I'm afraid of being wrong. I'm afraid of making mistakes. I'm afraid of those who are different. I'm afraid of being a little too exposed, a little too vulnerable. Here's the interesting thing. I know that when we isolate ourselves from each other, we are not less vulnerable. Our isolation simply denies us the opportunity to see and experience that much more of the image of God. And then our chasm widens. And I think that makes us miserable. It makes us miserable because that's not how we were created. We're not created for isolated living. We are not created to be separated one from another. So how do we stand against the ever-growing isolation that we face? The deep chasms we all look into. Amos and all the other prophets, past and present, remind us of that truth. They remind us that we are created in God's image for peace and justice. We are created to be in relationship with each other. And when we lose sight of that truth, our lives become miserable. God creates in us, in God's image, creates us to do mercy, to seek justice in and among all of creation. The first step to this is that superpower I talked about, sacred seeing. But sacred seeing is, as Thomas Merton said, an awakened heart. An awakened heart. This action of the awakened heart is a response to God's love of us. God's love and grace calling us toward communion with God and all of God's creation. It is love. It is God initiating our awakened hearts and creating in us a desire to move across chasms of separation and pain. Lazarus, as we heard, had to endure. Our invitation in the parable is to be awake. This means sacred seeing. We have heard Jesus say earlier in the Gospel of Luke, if your eye is healthy, your whole body is full of light. Our culture adds scales to our eyes, making it more difficult to use our superpower of sacred sight. We have to want to see, and we have to learn to see. We practice a way of seeing beyond what culture shows us. We practice this idea of being awake. And awake, we respond to the invitation issued in our gospel. Awake, we encounter God's desire for us to bridge these chasms of isolation. The chasm is bridged by the body, that is, the body of Christ. Christ gave his body to bridge that gap between you and I. Christ demonstrates the way to offer up life for life. That's why in the fullness of time, Jesus came into our world. His life, death, and resurrection show us that there are no chasms too broad or too deep to be bridged. We are that body in the world, and God's grace and love calls us, encourages us to open our eyes to the chasm. There are moments when the chasms are crossed. I have experienced them, and I know you have too. We call these sometimes God moments, awakenings of our heart, the opening of our eyes. Some of the most memorable are births and deaths. moments of transcendence, of forgiveness and understanding, moments where love triumphs, even momentarily, and we recognize God's incredible goodness and grace. In these moments, we move out of isolation and into communion, into community. We practice this sacred seeing, this heart way of knowing, this way of being awake in our community of faith. This is where we do it, here. In community, we practice loving each other and extending forgiveness. In community, we experience grace and remind each other to take a look outside our doors. In community, we ask for the courage to hear the cries of the afflicted and to experience the suffering of the world, so that together we might bridge the chasms dug by isolation and fear. The story of Lazarus and the rich man is both a warning and an invitation. I hope you can hear God inviting us with love to have an awakened heart and to open ourselves in love to those just beyond our doors and to move away from isolation. God invites us to engage God's mission in the work of healing, justice, and reconciliation. God invites us to remember that perfect love casts out all fear. That's the perfect love of Christ, who comes among us to stand in the deep, gaping chasms that separate us. In this community, we hear the invitation to stand together with the risen Christ, with arms outstretched in invitation and acceptance for all. To see the other, to listen to their cries for justice, to experience their suffering, and to know God's deep and abiding love. Over and over and over, Jesus talks about sight, about seeing. He talks about restoring sight, about healing the blind. Let's practice some superpowers together, some sacred vision, seeing with the eyes of our heart. We hear in the parable to use this power of sacred sight. And just like any skill, we just need to practice it. We need to use it to improve it. So open your eyes wide right now. Look out there at your neighbors. And I see the love of God in you. The light of Christ comes shining through. And I am blessed to be with you, O holy child of God.